Greetings and welcome back to yet another episode of Lua Tutorials, and all the previous videos consisted of some constructs of the language, the syntax which we used to actually create our programs. But in this one we'll take a look at some actual functions that are there to make our lives just a little bit easier. And the first one of those is something that we like to call a sort. In order to demonstrate this, first of all, I'm going to copy a function from the previous episode which is called printArray, and this is going to be used in pretty much everywhere that we're gonna need arrays, and whenever we need to see what's in them. And what this function does, it takes an array as a parameter, it loops through it, and what it does, it just outputs every single element of the array out in the console. So in this case, if we just printed out our array, in this example, what would happen is simply we would get the numbers that are already in the array. So a sort is usually what you want to do, or sometimes what you want to do, is have the numbers in your array in an ascending or a descending order. And how you can do that is use a function called table.sort. If you remember the previous video when we were talking about objects or classes, a table could be considered a class of some sort, and a sort could be considered a function inside of that class. So what you do in this situation, we would pass array as a parameter, as an argument, and because remember arrays are sent by reference, which means that any difference that happens or any change that happens in this function will also be visible on the outside, so outside of the function. So if you print out the array in this situation again, what you might notice is that the array is actually sorted. In this scenario, what happened is that the array was sorted in an ascending order, and for that reason what we got is simply numbers that start with a 1 and then with a 10, and every next number for the first one is bigger than the previous one. But what you might be wondering, okay, so this is like, okay, I can see some use in that because you are maybe comparing some values, but are there maybe other things we can do here? Can we maybe sort them in a descending order? And that's very possible. So what you have to do in that situation is use the same function, but supply it with another parameter. And in this case, what you have to do is also send in a function as its second parameter. And that sounds a bit weird and not something, if you're maybe used to programming in other languages, used to. But what happens is you send a comparison function, and this comparison function is then used whenever it's sorting the table. So in this situation, what we do is when it's comparing the first and the second value, we check if the first value is bigger than the second value, and in this case it is. And if this returns true, it's gonna swap them, and if it doesn't, it's not gonna swap them. That's not exactly how it works, but the important part is that this comparison function is gonna be used whenever we try to actually sort a table, and the rules of this comparison function are gonna be applied whenever we are sorting our array. And in this case, what you have to do if you want things to be in a descending order, you have to submit a logic that will allow the first argument to be bigger than the second one. Because if you look at it, the first argument or the first number is bigger than the second number, and then the second number is also bigger than the third number, so you can look at them in pairs. That sounds a bit confusing, and to really understand it, we would have to delve deeper into the function, but one of the main benefits of having this function is that we don't have to know how they work in order to use them. So if you just remember the syntax, you can always use this, and it's always gonna do whatever you want it to do. Sorting arrays is very useful because you can do a lot of things with them when they're sorted. You can perform some searches on it, like binomial search. You can then compare some values easier. Or in just some cases, you just want to know the biggest number, or maybe if you want to find the fifth biggest number, one thing you can do is send all the numbers in the array, sort them, and then just look at the fifth index, because you know that is going to be your fifth biggest number if you have them in an ascending order. Another fringe case use of the arrays can also be used when you have strings in them. So let me just copy an array that is filled with strings, and let me sort this array again. Let me of course print it out so we can see what actually happens when we do that. So you can see that the strings actually get sorted too, and they're actually sorted alphabetically. And in this situation, you can see that alphabet is first, banana is second, and mango is third. And first of all, the first string or the first letter is compared, so A is bigger than B, and it's bigger than M, so that's why it's on the first place. But if you had something like this, alphabet and banana, first what would happen is the first letter would be compared. If they are the same, then the second letter is compared. And in this case, A is before L, which means that this is the first number. One thing you have to remember whenever you're sorting things is that these are sorted on ASCII values, which means that even though they might seem like the same number, they're actually gonna be sorted differently, just because the big A actually has a lower value than a small a. And that sounds, again, a bit confusing, and you might be wondering why that is. And without going too much into detail, you have to know that the caps lock letters come before the lower caps lock letters. So that means that the upper characters come first before the lower characters. And then when you try maybe to incorporate some other characters like question marks and maybe exclamation marks, things get a bit confusing. But for the time being, just remember that the same rules apply whenever you're sorting strings as well. The only difference is that you have to do a multiple comparisons there. And if you want to sort them, of course, dishandedly again, another thing you would do is just use this function thingy again. You would just send in a function with the same exact logic, because what the computer is doing is not comparing letters like we are, it's actually comparing the numbers that represent those letters. And again, I know this sounds confusing, but the beauty of functions is that we don't have to know how they work in order to use them. So if you just want a sorted list of arrays, or maybe just a sorted array of numbers, we would just have to call this function. That would be it. The next thing we're going to take a look at is called a math library, and the math library has a bunch of useful math functions for us. And the first one I want to point out is a math.random function. Let's just print out and see what this math.random function does. As you might expect, this should generate a random number, but you can see that this number is not really random. In fact, it's exactly the same. But there's another thing we have to do in order to ensure its randomness. We have to set the seed for it. A seed is simply another number that determines at which point we start, and the seed we are using is the operating system time. And this is yet another function, yet another library, yet another class that has the function time in it. And the time function just gives back the time of our system based on some arbitrary amount of time. And what this means is that whenever we run a program, our time on our system will be different, maybe just even by a few milliseconds. So that means that the seed will be different, which means that a new number will actually be generated. And if you run this program, you can see that the numbers are being a bit different. You can see that there are some subtle changes, but not really big enough to say that these numbers are truly random. And the thing is, with some systems, so there's yet another catch, on some systems these numbers are, you have to run the math.random function again. And I don't want to get into too details because I don't really understand them myself, but the important thing to remember is that on some systems, I have a Windows 10 and maybe it's even dependent on your hardware, you have to run this multiple times, the math.random function. You don't even have to save the result, you just have to run it before you actually use the one that's fourth or maybe third, and that will actually then guarantee a random number. And you can see that the numbers are, thankfully, at this point, they do become random, and they are in between 0 and 1. So you might be wondering, okay, between 0 and 1, that's useful, but what if I want a bigger number? You know, maybe I want a number that's from 0 to 5. And the simple thing to solve this is you just multiply this random number by 5. You can consider this kind of a standardized way of giving you numbers back, because there are all the numbers between 0 and 1 are included. If you multiply the numbers by 5, you can expect an equal random distribution of numbers between 0 and 5. And maybe you just want integers, or maybe just whole numbers, you can also round that up. Or thankfully, the math.random function also provides you with yet another functionality that if you provide a parameter, it's going to give you a random number between 1 and the number that you set inside. So that means that we're going to get all the numbers from 1 to 5, you just put the whole number in. There are actually quite a few usabilities of the random function, and they can have multiple parameters that have different meanings, but I don't want to focus just on that. The important thing to remember is that these functions exist and that you can look them up whenever you're maybe creating your own programs in the documentation. One of the few things I just want to mention is that you have to set the seed once in the program. You can do it anywhere you want, and on some systems you have to run the math.random function multiple times to actually get a random number out of it. There are, of course, a few more math functions we can use. Maybe some of the most obvious ones are math.square root, and we learned how to do a square root without this notation, and you can do the same just by just saying the square root of a number is the power to a half, and that's maybe just a bit easier to write, but maybe it's not as nice to look at, and maybe if someone sees this, they're gonna know what's up, but well, this one maybe looks a bit clunkier. So you use whichever one you think looks better, there's really no right or wrong. And of course you have some trigonometry functions like cosinus and sinus, etc. And of course if we just do this, and if you input it, you can see that we get cosinus of this number. And of course there are also functions like math.min, which you can supply with multiple parameters, and what it does, it will just give you a minimum number. So in this case, when you have the numbers 1, 7, 9, and 14, it will tell you that the minimum number is 1. The same thing goes for the math.max function, which just returns a maximum number, so the biggest number. So of course these are all very useful functions that you can use, and they're, just as I said, plenty more. The important thing to realize is that this math library does exist, it has a lot of useful math functions, and that you are able to actually look it up online. One more thing I want to mention is the math.log function, and maybe this is not explicitly mentioned, but this is a natural logarithm of a function. So we just print out this, we can expect a result about 1, because the e number is about 1. So the natural logarithm of e is expected to be 1. You might be saying, okay, but this, I've been looking through the documentation and the only thing I can find is a logarithm of this number. How can I actually have a logarithm of base 2, of base 10, of like any other base? And you can just do a simple math trick. So let's say we have a variable called base and want it to be in 10, and if you want any logarithm to be in this base, what you have to do is use the math log of the number you wanna log, so let's say 100, and you have to divide it with the math of log of the base you want to have it in. So let's say in this case, if you just wrote this out, and what the result of this is going to be the same as if we actually had a log of base 10 of the number 100. So this is maybe a more not as elegant way to do it, but just mathematically this is how you actually have a logarithm of a different base and you express it with a logarithm of the natural base. And this works for any other base. So if you want to maybe have a base of 100, you just change the base variable, and in this case this is exactly what you're gonna get. So maybe if you're doing logarithms and you want to do other bases than the natural base, this is the way to do it. Just the very last thing I want to mention is a constant that's called math.huge, and that's a very appropriate name for what it is. And math.huge is basically just an operation that results in infinity. So just to give you an example, if 1 divided by 0, which is obviously an undefined number or an infinite number, we'll say this is infinity. And I just want to showcase that this is exactly the case, because 1 divided by 0 is indeed the same as math.huge, and you're gonna print this as infinity. So math.huge is simply a constant, a value that is infinity, and you can use it to compare if your results end up in infinity and maybe do something with it. I just want to point out that this is a constant that exists in Lua. This is sometimes what's going to happen if you divide by 0, or maybe have any other operations that result in infinity. Your programming language will tell you that this is not a valid operation, it's going to crash or whatever. But Lua has a separate variable or a constant that is math.huge, and that is containing so-called infinity. So you can use that to maybe operate on some mathematical things that maybe you didn't know how to do in other languages, or maybe you just didn't know how to do before. So the next library we're going to take a look at is called the OS library, or the operating system library. And this actually has a few functions that are very useful for us whenever we're designing mods, I think. And the first, maybe the most obvious one, is called the os.date. And if you just output this, you can see what it does is simply give you a string value of your time, of your date, and of your day, actually, of your hour that you're recording this in, or I mean just using this in my case, of course, the time I'm recording this in. So this is very useful whenever you're maybe creating programs. Maybe you want something to happen on a given date, maybe you want to just keep track of time or whatever. But this is maybe not the most standardized way to do it. Another one that's also very useful, and I think you need to know if you're programming, especially dealing with time, is os.time. And you can see that this is just a jumble of letters. But if you run this, you can see that the last number actually goes up about every second, so that means that it is keeping time in seconds. This is called the epoch time, and I think it's based on the 1st of January 1970, which means that this is basically the seconds it took from that date and up until this point. So why that arbitrary number? Well, there's no reason for it. There's just some, weird standards going on there that you don't really have to worry about. But the important thing is that this is in fact in seconds, and it is useful whenever you're keeping track of time, because you're only dealing with seconds and you don't have to deal with formatting this whole string. And another function that is also useful, somewhat useful, is called OS clock. And what this does is just keeps track of how much time has passed for your program to execute. And you can see that sometimes this number is 0.001, sometimes it's 0, and sometimes it's 0.2, and that all depends on how your computer handles it. But for the most part, this OS clock just sees for how long your program has been running, and it tells you for how long it has been executing. And in some cases that can be very useful. Maybe if you want to keep track of how long your program is executing, you can see just how much time has passed in or whenever you want to do something. And of course, it is also good if you want to check if maybe you optimize your code to see if those optimizations are actually useful, and then maybe run some tests on it. And these are just the 3 of the main functions of the OS I think that you can use whenever you're creating mods that rely on time or dates or anything like that. The last library we're going to take a look at is a string library. And again, we've been dealing with strings for a long time, but we haven't really dealt with tools to deal with strings. And I think one of the most useful string functions is a string.find function. And what it does is, let's say that we have 2 strings. One is coming home and the second one is home. And what we want to do is find where this home string exists in the first string. So if you just run this, you can see that the home string exists on the 7th character. Of course, if you look at this, it starts at the 7th character and it goes to the 10th character. So that means from the 7th to the 10th character in the first string, we found that the home exists. And this is very useful whenever you're dealing with strings and whenever you want to find if a substring exists in a string. So we just wrote something like pineapple here. Of course, this does not exist, so it returns the value of nil. And if you just write home, like in the previous example, again, we'll see that it does successfully find this substring that's listed as a 2nd parameter in our first string that's listed as our 1st parameter. And that's a very useful function. I think whenever you're dealing with strings, oftentimes you will want to find something and maybe do something with that information. When you know where this exists in the first one, then you can do a lot of things from there. Another useful function that you can use is string.lower or string.upper. They both work. And what it does is basically it just puts everything in the lowercase or everything in the uppercase. And that's very useful if you're reading an input from the user and you want to just standardize it when you're comparing it. So instead of having to compare for every single different value of banana, so maybe if the user enters the banana with a capital or if they enter everything with uppercases, what you can do is just use this function to get it to lower characters, all of it, and then just compare the lower strings, because you know that is always going to be the same. And of course the same goes for string.upper, which is the exact same function. What it does, it just transforms everything into the upper characters so that everything is capsed. And the last one that I want to mention is string.reverse, and that is not something that maybe is very useful when you're dealing with things, and if you just want to use it for whatever reason, just know that it exists. What it does is it takes a string as a parameter and it outputs the reverse of that string. So if you just wrote homeboy, the reverse is yo moch, I guess. So basically what it does, it just reverses the string that you give it as its parameter. And of course, all of the functions I've mentioned today, these are not all the functions that exist. I just want to name a few so they maybe stick in memory, some of the ones that I end up using whenever I'm doing programs. And the most important thing is that you know that these classes exist and that you know how to Google them and search for them in the documentation whenever you find them. And if you want more of that, what you can do is go to the Lua reference manual. You can just Google that Lua reference manual, or maybe just go to this website. Again, I repeat that this is for the Lua for 0.1.5, which is the Lua we are using, and the newer Lua 0.53 is has a lot more functions that you can play with, but we are not using them because this Lua does not support them. We don't know in which Lua or which version of Lua the Isaac game will actually run when it comes out, the modding, but we can expect that to be newer than this version. But for the sake of learning, I feel like we should focus just on the older version to get the basics down, and then when we get the basics down, then maybe we can focus on some of the newer functionalities of the newer version of Lua. So yeah, if you want to look at the functions, see what you can do, and maybe you just want to develop something and you don't know the problem or how to solve it, you can look at the reference manual, or of course always Google the answer, because usually, or at least most of the time, there is someone who has had a similar problem to you and someone has helped them solve it already. So with that said, let's jump onto our example, which is a bit more extensive, so I'll just take a bit more time to explain that in between. So this concludes this part, and you can expect the next part to come in about 3 days, titled pretty much the same as any other video, and it's gonna be just one big example. We're gonna create a little game where we can move around, place bombs, destroy walls, and kill enemies, things like that, pick up hearts. Very similar in idea to Isaac, but I just want to showcase you a few of the possibilities and how we can combine everything that we learned at this point and just merge it into one big program. And for that reason, I just want to show you and showcase you that at this point we've actually learned more than enough to start creating some really amazing mods. So at this point it's just practice, 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 and of course asking questions so you can get answers to them, and that way we can all get better when whoever is helping you, and of course you who gets the answer can also learn something new. So with that said, I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and of course I hope to see you next time.